The earliest known written reference to cannabis, also called marijuana, dates back nearly 5,000 years to around 2727 BCE in ancient China. At that time, the plant was valued not as a recreational substance, but as a natural remedy. Early Chinese texts describe cannabis as useful for easing pain, treating inflammation, and addressing a variety of physical ailments. Knowledge of the plant slowly traveled westward, and civilizations such as the ancient Greeks and Romans became familiar with its properties. Across the Middle East, cannabis spread throughout the Islamic world and eventually into North Africa, becoming woven into medical, cultural, and spiritual practices. By the 16th century, cannabis crossed the Atlantic into the Western Hemisphere. Spanish colonizers brought the plant to Chile, primarily for its industrial potential. Hemp fibers were strong, durable, and ideal for rope, sails, and textiles. Not long after, cannabis reached North America. Spanish settlers introduced hemp cultivation, and during the earliest colonial period, it was grown widely on farms. Hemp quickly became one of the most valuable crops in the colonies, rivaling tobacco in importance. The story of cannabis in what would become the United States began in earnest in 1611, when hemp plants were transported across the Atlantic by the first English settlers in Jamestown, Virginia. A few years later, in 1619, King James I of England ordered American colonists to increase hemp production to support England's growing maritime needs. The Virginia Company, which governed Jamestown, instructed landowners to plant and export hemp, often mandating quotas such as 100 plants per landholder. Hemp cultivation soon became a cornerstone of England's colonial strategy, helping expand its economic and political influence in the New World. Cannabis farming played a substantial role in the formation of early America. Even figures like George Washington cultivated hemp at Mount Vernon as one of their primary crops. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, hemp was indispensable for making rope, clothing, paper, and ship materials. After cannabis reached New England in 1629, it spread rapidly, and from colonial times through the Civil War, it was considered an essential agricultural product. Entire economic plans depended on its success. By the late 1700s, hemp farming expanded into Kentucky, and by the 1800s, large-scale hemp operations existed in Mississippi, Georgia, California, South Carolina, and Nebraska. Cannabis was not only an industrial crop, it was also widely used as medicine. In 1839, it was formally introduced to Western medicine by physician William O'Shaughnessy, who studied its effects and taught other doctors how cannabis could relieve muscle spasms, pain, migraines, and sleep disorders. By the 1850s, cannabis-based remedies were commonly sold in American pharmacies and were considered standard treatments, especially before the invention of aspirin. As medicine became more commercialized, governments began regulating drug sales. These laws were not originally aimed at banning cannabis, but at preventing fraud, mislabeling, and the sale of dangerous substances. States passed regulations requiring warning labels, limiting access to licensed pharmacies, and requiring prescriptions for certain drugs. Some laws restricted sales to minors and limited prescription refills. According to a U.S. Department of Agriculture bulletin from the late 19th century, at least 29 states had laws addressing cannabis in some form. States such as Wisconsin and Louisiana required prescriptions for cannabis sales. Others, including Nebraska and New York, focused on labeling requirements rather than outright restrictions. In New York, cannabis was initially listed as a poison under a law passed in 1860 after several suicides involving toxic substances. Early drafts of the law required a doctor's written order for cannabis purchases, but the final version allowed sales without prescriptions as long as detailed records were kept. All cannabis packaging, however, had to display the word poison in bold red capital letters. Even in states without strict poison laws, regulation efforts continued. In California, lawmakers attempted in 1880 to regulate opium and other narcotics, including hemp-based preparations. Although that bill was withdrawn, similar proposals followed before the turn of the century. Across much of the American frontier, however, law enforcement was inconsistent or non-existent. Vast territories operated with little oversight, and cannabis cultivation and use remained largely unrestricted. Historians note that cannabis thrives in environments shaped by human activity, open fields, cleared land, and disturbed soil. The American frontier of the mid to late 19th century was the perfect habitat. By this period, cannabis grew abundantly across the western United States. In regions where tobacco was scarce or expensive, cannabis became a popular alternative. It was cheaper, easy to grow, and in some places could be found growing wild along roadsides. This era marked a major shift. For the first time in American history, cannabis was widely consumed for its psychoactive effects rather than strictly for medical or industrial purposes. Recreational use began to spread, and a new chapter emerged: the age of the so-called cannabis cowboys. During the 19th century, irrigation projects transformed the Western landscape, and Mexican laborers played a major role in this transformation. Along with their labor, they brought cultural traditions, including recreational cannabis use. After the Mexican-American War, Texas became home to a large population of displaced Mexicans fleeing political instability and foreign pressure in their homeland. Texas soon became one of the first frontier regions to see a noticeable rise in recreational cannabis use. At first, this use was mostly confined to working-class communities, particularly Mexican laborers, African-American cowboys, and ranch workers. Cannabis remained unfamiliar to many settlers, who still preferred alcohol, opiates, and other substances. Around this time, cannabis also became known by a new name: marijuana, an anglicized version of a Spanish slang term. The name itself would later play a powerful role in shaping public perception. In the early 20th century, waves of Mexican refugees fleeing the dictatorship of President Porfirio Diaz brought marijuana culture deeper into the United States. One of the most legendary figures associated with this era was Francisco Pancho Villa, outlaw, revolutionary, and folk hero. Villa, often described as the Robin Hood of Mexico, was known not only for his military skill, but also for his love of indulgence, including cannabis. Much of what is known about Villa comes from oral traditions preserved in Mexican folk songs known as corridos. These songs portray him as both a fierce warrior and a man who embraced life's pleasures. During the Mexican Revolution, Villa's exploits were immortalized in battle hymns like Adelita and La Cucaracha. While Adelita tells a tragic love story, La Cucaracha became Villa's unofficial anthem, celebrating his victories, struggles, and wild lifestyle. La Cucaracha openly references marijuana, which was commonly used by Villa's troops. Historians believe that nearly half of his army, many of them indigenous Yaqui fighters, regularly consumed marijuana, sometimes even before battle, believing it provided courage and strength. Alcoholic drinks like mezcal were also widely consumed. Villa himself was known for extravagant living, blending charisma, excess, and ruthless effectiveness as a military leader. Born Dorodio Arango, Villa grew up in extreme poverty. He became an outlaw and bandit, earning admiration from poor farmers by raiding wealthy landowners. His life took a revolutionary turn after personal tragedy and injustice pushed him towards social reform. Initially motivated by personal gain, Villa eventually aligned himself with revolutionary leader Francisco Madero, whose vision of land reform deeply influenced him. Despite arrests, near executions, and imprisonment, Villa escaped, regrouped, and seized control of cities, funding his army through taxation and legalized vices. At his peak, he was hailed as Madero's most powerful general, but his fortunes declined after conflicts with rivals supported by the United States. A failed raid into New Mexico triggered a U.S. military pursuit that weakened his forces. His final campaign ended in defeat, reportedly worsened by drunkenness and intoxication among his troops. Villa was assassinated in 1923. What remains undeniable is the cultural impact that Villa and Mexican cannabis traditions had on the American West. As the frontier closed and formal governments took hold, tolerance for cannabis faded. The plant became increasingly associated with immigrants, crime, and fear. By the early 20th century, the term marijuana replaced cannabis in newspapers and political rhetoric, intentionally emphasizing its foreign origins. Sensational headlines linked marijuana to violence and insanity. Influential figures pushed prohibition, and in 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act effectively criminalized cannabis nationwide. By 1936, every state had already banned recreational use. Cannabis use continued underground until the 1960s, when it resurfaced during the counterculture movement and Vietnam War protests. Yet prohibition remained firm. In 1970, the Controlled Substances Act classified cannabis as illegal for all purposes. Today, that stance has shifted once again. Many states have legalized cannabis for medical or recreational use. Still, modern cannabis bears little resemblance to its Wild West ancestor. Its journey, from ancient medicine to frontier staple, outlawed vice, and regulated commodity, mirrors America's own evolving values. The history of cannabis in the Wild West reminds us that this plant has always been shaped by culture, fear, politics, and power, and in turn, it has shaped them right back.